Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for a chat about public service of the future. Who remembers the 1980s? Put your hand up if you remember the 1980s. All right, in the chat, what do you remember about the 1980s? Or if you were too young or like me, just being born in the 1980s, what do the 80s mean to you? Madonna. Nice. What else have we got? What do you remember about the 1980s? The hair was big. The makeup was garish. New Kids on the Block. All right. Yeah, good hair. Good hair. We had an 80s party a few years ago, and I had a lot of fun using an entire can of hairspray. Terrible fashion. Yeah, it wasn't great, was it? We got MTV. I didn't actually get music videos until I was, I reckon, about 15, but I know that other people had MTV. We got PCs. We got big brick mobile phones. The Berlin Wall came down. But those of you who are politics nerds, when I say, what do you remember about the 1980s, might say to me, Rogernomics. You might say to me, new public management, Alicia. If there's one thing I think about when it comes to the 1980s, it's probably the Public Finance Act and the State Sector Act. Whoa, that's what really jumps out at me. Everyone think that about the 80s? No? Just me? Well, if you're looking to level up your public leadership nerd knowledge, you are in the right place. Thrilling times, says Abby. Absolutely. The stuff that we all really care about. So what happened in the 1980s was, aside from all of that other exciting stuff, we decided in New Zealand, as we often do, that we were going to be pioneers. There's lots of cool stuff that we've done first. We gave women the vote pretty early on. We got EFTPOS first, as it turned out. Reefton, a town that you might not all be totally familiar with, little town in the West Coast, was the first place in the Southern Hemisphere to get electricity. What didn't we do first? But one thing we did do first was we took a stab at the way we do government. So there was a lot of excess in the 80s, excess eyeshadow, excess hairspray, and excess bureaucracy, and absolutely excess government spending. So anyone who's ever seen that British TV show Glide Time, or maybe those of you who watch Yes Minister, will be familiar with the idea of government as a bit crook, a bit stupid and a bit spendy. And we certainly weren't that bad. But what I can tell you about the 80s, when everything started going mental and inflation started kicking off and everything went a bit weird, was that we were in a position where we were spending a lot, where the public service was growing very quickly, and where we couldn't always point to what it was that we were delivering for that money. So there was a real public feeling about the public service and the way that we did things. And that feeling was that we were just all bureaucrats with a safe ticket. And in some ways that was true. We had permanent heads of department. Once you were a CE, you were pretty much set for life. You had a pretty cozy relationship with your minister, and it was difficult. It was difficult to be gotten rid of. So what we did is we decided that we were going to be pioneers, and we went, look, we can see that this isn't going well, and we can also see that it's pretty trendy out there in the world at the moment to try and copy business. Because if there's one thing we know about 1980s, it's that we should all learn lessons from the way businesses were run in that time. Anyone who's seen The Wolf of Wall Street, which is one of my personal favourite movies, might feel a bit differently. But we went, right, we're not doing a great job, and I know what we're going to do. We are going to emulate what we see happening in the private sector. So we decided to do a couple of things. One of those was to get... was to use a bit of economic theory, so a bit of public choice theory, and go, right, we need to really bring some rigour into the way that we spend money and the way that we set things up and the way that we make decisions. And the other thing that we did was we went, well, if we're not so flash on the management front, but we're pretty sure that businesses are doing it better than us, we're going to try and bring in some real private sector thinking to the way that we run our businesses being our government departments. So we want to see more contracts. We want to see more key performance indicators. We want efficiency at all costs. We want to split everything up into nice, neat chunks. So we'd like to take our policy delivery and our operations, and we'd like to split those right out. We'd like to take the thinking and the doing and put them into neat little pockets. We'd like to take these large government agencies and put them into lots of little sections that don't necessarily talk to each other. So we went on this real drive, and the two pieces of legislation that were massive in that time, that really changed the game, were the Public Finance Act and the State Sector Act. And they said, look, what we need is to see real efficiency and contractualism in the public sector. And we need to make sure that we're holding people accountable. So that means no more permanent heads of our departments. We want chief executives on 3 to 5 year terms. It means that we want our funding, our spending and our delivery split out, and that we want all of those really firmly guided by a set of principles that are all about efficiency, making sure that we spend our money for short-term excellent results. We set up state-owned enterprises, we set up Crown research institutes, and we generally just tried to tidy everything up. So there were a lot of really good reasons why we did that, and the rest of the world looked on not too dissimilar from how they currently are, and went, wow, New Zealand's given their public service a real kick up the arse. We should be like them. They know what they're doing. We were very cool, we were very trendy. So that was all right at the outset. We sharpened our pencils. We really got people thinking differently. We slashed and burned. So we got rid of a massive number of public servants. But by about the late 90s, so we got our fourth Labor government in 99, by then the cracks were kind of starting to show a little bit. Things weren't going so well. Does anyone know potentially what some of the issues were that we were starting to experience kind of late 90s, early 2000s in government? Take a stab at it in the chat box if you've got some ideas about what wasn't going so well. Anyone game? Oh, health and safety. Oh, we didn't figure that out until like mid-late 2000s, mate. We were just letting everybody climb a ladder with their shirt off and fall off and die in the forest at that point. Health and safety took a while. There was a bunch of things that weren't going so well. So yeah, social services, yep, we weren't doing a very good job of that. We were spending a lot, but we certainly weren't getting better outcomes. So what was happening at that time was all of that splitting out had meant that we had a lot of fragmentation, right? So build a road. Oh, I like that. Now, if I'm so pleased that all of our election campaigning and political rhetoric has moved past looking at building roads as the answer to all of our problems. Oh, wait, hold on. It hasn't. Anyway, so we'd started to see everybody splitting out into all these sections, right? Agencies were really fragmented. We had a department for everything. They weren't talking to each other. It turns out that splitting out those that make decisions and those that implement them doesn't always work very well. And because there was no incentive for any of those fragments to collaborate, because of our very neat and tidy contracts and performance frameworks, it wasn't happening. So we had a lot of duplication. We had a lot of inefficiency. And what we tried to figure out was how to fix that. So that's what started our wave of public sector restructuring. Put your hand up in the gallery if you have been part of a restructure in your organisation in the last year. I'll chuck it in the chat. Yeah, seeing some thumbs up in there. Yeah, so between, I think, 99 or 2000, when Labor came in, and 2007, we launched 36 high-level restructures across government. We don't even have 36 government agencies anymore, right? 36. And we certainly haven't slowed down, but what we've done is we've stopped doing it all the way up here and we've started doing it below the belt, right, at the business unit level. So restructuring became an answer as far as we could find for how we change the way we set things up, merge things together, try and get people talking. All those KPIs and contracts were getting us into trouble as well. So what was happening was we were starting to focus on really short-term outcomes because that's what we were measured on. And we weren't doing a particularly good job of thinking about all of the other things that make for good public service. Because the thing is that there is a bit of a difference between selling products and services and delivering outcomes to a community. And when we tried to take the same thinking and put it in this spot, we got into a bit of trouble. So there was some KPI and contract issues. We were starting to run like a business because we thought we had to. The way that we procured and the way that we delivered services meant not only were we starting to think like a business, which is really hard to do, by the way, when you're not one, but also that we were seeing a lot of money being spent on business type activities, a lot of rebrands. We got into a lot of trouble for that. We slashed and burned massively, and it turns out that all those people who worked there actually knew some stuff. So we had about 18,000 people worth of institutional knowledge just pick up and walk out of the public sector, and we lost a lot of really important capability. So we started rehiring again, sort of mid-2000s, and obviously we've got a freeze on that now. So that tends to go a bit like this. And we'd also started putting efficiency ahead of things like effectiveness and quality service delivery. So we'd made some initial gains when it came to sharpening our pencil and saving money, but we were starting to see the fallout of that on the other end when it came to the way we're delivering services. So it's really easy to look back in hindsight, I think, and say, we all looked really stupid in the 80s. The hair was awful. The eyeshadow shouldn't have happened. Maybe some of those public sector reforms weren't the best thing that we could have done. But it's also worth saying that those decisions were made for a reason, and that for many of the reasons that they were implemented, they really did their job. We sharpened our pencil, we got our act together. We've got the lowest corruption in the developed world at the government level, right? So we really broke up that minister-CE relationship. We've done a really good job of getting independence and autonomy and accountability back into the public service. We had really poor information flows. We made really crappy decisions. We didn't do a good job of figuring out where all our dollars were going, and we're good at that now. So all of those things that we needed to change were important, and we've changed them. So I think it's really easy to look back on the past and wonder why we've done things. But the fact is that yesterday's adaptations are today's routines, and what looks now like the way we've always done things largely aren't. So we've done some fiddling around at the edges over the last kind of 10 or 20 years. We've tried to work within the systems that we set up in the late 80s to do a better job of bringing people back together. A lot more restructures, but also things like statements of intent and strategic priorities to try and get people thinking a little bit more big picture and a little bit less one step in front of them. But every system is perfectly designed to produce the results that it gets, right? So I think that what we've been trying to do over the last 10 or 20 years is to use the tools that we've got in the system that we've got to do different things. And there have been some really incredible successes from that. And we've got heroes that have really pushed through, but we're pushing against the system rather than changing it. So while heroes might overcome the odds, systems change the odds. And that's what we've done with the Public Service Act of 2020. So the new piece of legislation that's come in this year is having a crack at shifting in response to our environment. Because things are different than they were in the 80s. We don't just look different and listen to better music. There isn't just a lot less synthesizing and keyboarding. But also our problems are different. And I think that COVID's been a really good example of that, because it shows that it's not just a one-person job responding to the kind of stuff that government's dealing with now. So whether we're thinking about housing or about education or about pandemic response, all of these things are really tangled up. And it's like community and business and government and housing and education and health are all kind of like this, right? And when we're encouraging people to live in silos, it's kind of like training every leg of a racehorse to run well. It doesn't work. We end up with a system that's less than the sum of its parts. And some of those systems issues sit really deep, and we only see them when they pop up. So here's a story for you. Does anyone remember the budget leak from earlier last year? Hand up if you remember the budget leak. Yeah. So what happened, what it looked like what happened was there'd been a tremendous failure of the information systems that had enabled a dirty hacker to get in and find the budget and spread it. And it was like political chaos, you might remember. The government was pointing fingers at the opposition, the police were called, there was an emergency press conference, it was this whole thing. And it turned out that actually, a bit of egg on the face, Turns out it wasn't a leak or a hack at all. It turns out that if you just Googled the right search terms on Treasury's website, you could get hold of the budget before it was due to be released. And so that was interesting enough. But I reckon that happened on like the Monday or the Tuesday. And the Friday of that week, I was speaking at Treasury. So I was going in to give a presentation to a bunch of change managers. And I had my partner with me, who's my videographer. And when we were going up the lift to Treasury, I was saying to him, oh, it's going to be tight security here. It's going to be interesting getting in after the week we've had on the budget front. And so imagine our surprise when we got to the front desk and I said to the lady behind the counter, hi, I'm Alicia. I'm speaking here today. And she said, oh, okay. Yeah, hang on a minute. And she came out from behind the desk and walked over to the main door, to the hallway, swiped a swipe card, kicked it open with her foot and just sort of went, down there, I think it's the meeting room at the end. We went, oh, okay. So I had Cam with me, who had a suitcase full of air gear, and we just kind of wandered into Treasury. We hadn't signed in, and what was going on, it's fine. Found the meeting room, did the presentation. There was 45 odd people in there. And then at the end of the session, I was doing the chat, you know, chatting to people who'd been in the audience. And they all had little name stickers on from signing in. And I noticed the second or third person that I spoke to, her name was Christine. And I thought, I could have sworn the last person I spoke to's name was Christine as well. And so I sort of looked around. I looked back again. And I said to the woman I was talking to, sorry, can I just interrupt you? Either all change managers are named Christine or there's something going on here. What's going on here? And she goes, we all came in as a big group and the girl behind the counter didn't want to sign us all in individually. So she just swiped a card and hit print a few times and sent us all in. So we've all got Christine on. And I went, wow, okay. So the same week that the budget's leaked, we've got 40, 50 people milling around inside Treasury. Nobody knows who we are, doing whatever we like. And I think that's a really good explanation of how systems issues work, right? Because there's no such thing as a single crime. And when you look at the report that came out in March this year that investigated how things had happened with the budget leak, they were saying, look, actually there's some really systemic issues inside Treasury around just governance and risk and making good decisions and ensuring security and privacy. And I wasn't totally surprised by that, because it's very rare that the problems that we see when we're trying to work are the result of a single person. So it was very unlikely in Treasury that the guy who was project managing putting the budget online, or that the chick behind the counter, were the ones in the wrong. And the same is true of leadership in the public service. If we aren't getting the results that we want, it is very, very unlikely that that's the result of individuals who aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing. So I've spent my whole career in the public service, and I know that people come to work genuinely motivated to do a good job. People are here because they care. They're not here because it's easy. They're not here because they make a lot of money. They're here because they care. And so if people are coming along every day trying to do the right thing and motivated to do a good job, and that's not happening, then the things that we need to shift are structural and they're systemic. So the Public Service Act recognises that, and it's hitting 5 kind of key markers. So it's looking at a unified public service. So it's saying, look, splitting everything out, not super smart. We're going to try and bring everyone back together. There's some really cool ways that we're looking at doing that. So we've got interdepartmental ventures and executive boards. We've got a public service leadership team that brings together CEs and key people from across government to make decisions at the top about how things need to go. We've got the ability to have joint operational agreements across agencies, and also to have systems leaders, which I'm really excited about, by the way, as an idea, because I've been preaching this for a while. So we've got systems leaders now that look at problems and how they interact, rather than focusing on the specific domain of a single agency. So we've got some real unity that we want to start building in there. We want to improve our relationships with Māori and also with stakeholders outside of the public service. So when we think about things like the pandemic, you can't just mobilise 5 million people to stay in their homes with government alone. The voice is helpful, the regulation is helpful, but you need the cooperation and relationships with business and community groups and communities themselves to make that possible. We're looking at employment and workforce. So how does a public service career look now? Is it that you enter as a junior advisor or a junior analyst and work your way up and then maybe get a secondment? Or actually, is it possible now for you to be easily transferred across task forces, joint committees, interdepartmental ventures, across different agencies? So we're making that easier. We're looking at leadership and we're saying, what does tomorrow's leadership look like? And that's what I want to talk to you guys about today. What are the skills that we actually need in the public service that we're not currently developing that will make it possible for us to tackle those really curly problems? The ones that we don't put on the 100% New Zealand billboards, the ones that seem really hard and go really deep, the things like intergenerational poverty and outcomes for our most vulnerable children and inequity in our health system. Those things can't be tackled by a single department. They need us to work together. And so how are we leading through those? And we're looking at organisational flexibility. So rather than establishing a single agency and then just restructuring them on the inside 42 times a year, actually, how can we be more flexible in the way that we set things up so that we don't need to do that? Because the human cost of not just slashing the public service in the 80s, but restructuring them for the last 20 years, because it was the only tool we had at our disposal, is really high. People are really uncertain all the time. I did a count last Thursday when I was running a workshop at Te Papa, and I had, I don't know, maybe 10 or 12 different government agencies represented in the room. And I was looking around the room, figuring out who was currently in or had just been in or was going into a restructure. And it was nearly every single one of those agencies. So we've become really over-dependent on shuffling people around as the answer. And that's really troublesome because it's making it hard for us to feel safe and to feel certain and to do a good job. So hopefully enabling more of that flexibility in our organisations is going to go some way to tackling some of that. What I really like about this spread is that we're not just touching one thing. So it's a real systems view. We're looking at people. We're looking at the what, the how, and the why. We've gotten really clear on what those public sector values are. We've really got clear on what we need to do differently. And I think that that's a really excellent start. But what I'm really interested in seeing now is how we can enact that at an agency level. Because I don't know about you guys, but on the one hand, I'm really excited about the idea that we can have these joint initiatives and these interdepartmental boards. But on the other hand, I work in these places and I know that there are people who work in the same office that don't talk to each other. I know that there are people 5 computers apart that don't know what projects they're working on. So I'm like, yeah, this is really cool. This sounds great. But the reality is, how are we going to change the way people think about what their work is? And I think the key to a lot of that is changing what we think a public service leadership career looks like, what the skills are that we need, how we're developing those skills in people, how we're matching those skills to the kind of challenges that we've got ahead of us, and how we're incentivizing that behavior. So what are the structures and the processes and the policies that sit underneath that? Because what I've noticed in the last, especially 5 years, is that we tend to pick some really cool values like collaboration, agile, spirit of service, and we put it on a poster and we put colours with it and we stick it on the wall and we put it on the backs of the doors and the toilet, and then we just wonder why that's not making people more agile and collaborative, because we are shouting it at conferences. We did make a nice web page. It's on the intranet. Why isn't it happening? And the reason it's happening is because we ask for collaboration, but we don't even allow people to share a cost code. We want people to work together differently and to work speedily, but we're actually really risk averse, and it's really hard to get a joint initiative over the line. We don't approve it. And it happens because when people go to their quarterly performance reviews, we review them based on the really short-term KPIs that their business unit is measured on. And there's no incentive to get out there and try new projects and let things fail and work with people from other departments. So it's all very well us saying this stuff, but I think that we need to think quite differently about the way that we not just work with people, but the rules that we have to make that possible. So I'm quite keen to know, before I launch into what I think the most important public leadership skills of the future are, what do you think are the most important untaught leadership skills? What do you wish you knew or the people who manage you knew to do better? Just chuck in the chat. What are we not teaching? Soft skills instead of technical skills, totally. Caring for people. Karen, you anarchist. Empathy, says Deb. Not talking, says Kelly. So the other person talks heaps and tells you more than you ever would. Oh yeah, how to shut up. So we taught this at Meetings That Matter the other week, and you might have just noticed me doing it, but when it comes to asking questions online, that's a really good practicing point for that. So when I ask you guys a question, like put in the chat, what do you think is the most untaught leadership skill? The hardest bit is then just looking down the camera for 25 seconds, smiling like an idiot, hoping someone answers. It's hard. It's particularly hard in an environment where your job's always on the line and you feel like you need to be proving that you're valuable and that you know something. So I really like that, teaching people not to talk. The power of vulnerability-based trust, says Cam. How to develop ourselves and our people for real, not just token, yeah. So not just ticking off things on a CV or thinking about our next move or our next secondment, but actually how do we help people to serve better, to be better leaders? I love that. Naomi says that we aren't teaching that the real customer is the community, and not all teams really truly work in this way. That's awesome. So what's the big picture here? What's the impact that we're trying to make? What are the outcomes we're trying to deliver on? Catherine says, not even skills, process topics. Like, how do we make decisions? Oh, mate, you're going to like the next bit. That is a good segue. I like that. Kelly, doing what is right despite the KPI. Yeah, and I really like that one, Kelly, because I think that's one of those things we put on the posters, isn't it? Like, here, we do what's right. We go, but are we allowed? And are we celebrated for that? And what if we do what's right and it leads to us not delivering on something else? Are we going to be in trouble for that? Are we going to struggle with that on our PDP? Are we going to let somebody else down? Are we going to have tricky questions from the minister or from the ELT? Deb says taking responsibility as a leader and how to work together with fellow leaders. Or you're speaking my language now. Having agency and taking responsibility and actually working with others. Yeah, because it's one thing to talk about delivering on these really exciting joint initiatives where we solve all these big problems. But if we can't actually put our own stuff away and stop protecting our own patch to make that happen, that's really hard. Naomi says a lack of acknowledgement where a manager deals with poor performance in a respectful and positive way. Yeah, so if we assume positive intent, that everyone is coming to work to do a good job, and that if they're not doing a good job, there's probably something else we need to change, that changes our conversations, right? I reckon there's 5. And I reckon that because I've just written a book on this, and it started off as like a 40,000 word book, like my last one. And now it's in the final stages with my copy editor and it's 90,000 words. I went a bit ham on it. I couldn't help myself. So I've spent the last better part of a year deep inside what those skills look like. And I reckon there's 5. So if you look at what the World Economic Forum says about the future of work, and you go, okay, even if you weren't in government and you didn't have a new act to deal with, the future of work is changing and we need different things from people. They talk about things like creativity and critical thinking and collaboration. Those are the kind of things we put on posters, but we're not sure about what the behaviours look like. If you look at some of the data from places like BCG or McKinsey or Deloitte's, they're saying, yeah, the skills both in business and in government are those intangible, untaught, intuitive skills. They're saying that fewer than 1 in 4 chief executives in HR departments are confident that their leaders have the skills that will be relevant over the next few years to cope with change. And in having read all of the data and thought about a lot of the teams that I work with across government, I reckon I've landed on 5 of them. And when I think about it, I've been thinking about it a bit like a lock, because I think the problem is that the way we do leadership at the moment is we teach people to be technically proficient, right? So we're like, be really good at the thing you know and develop incredible expertise in that. And this is already problematic, right? Because the half-life of a skill now is less than 5 years. So that new coding skill set that you just invested in, like in a couple of years' time, no good to you. But anyway, we do this. We go, right, Be a technical expert. And then we go, oh, okay, you need to manage some people now. Okay, here's how you might manage people. Yeah, figure that out. So we've kind of done that bit. Some people are better at that than others. And then we've gone, oh, you've hit the ceiling of your effort there. Self-awareness. What color is your dot? What bird are you? What disc profile are you? Right? And so we've gone, well, if you have technical knowledge and you can manage people and you kind of know about your own personality, you'll be okay. And where a lot of this stuff sits is we go, what are your strengths and how can you use those, right? So if you're a KBI blue dot dove bird or whatever your leadership profile says you are, well, that means that you just need to be respectful of others and use that strength, and then expect that if they're a red, they're going to respond like this. And, you know, there's a whole lot of that. And what's problematic about that is that we're encouraging people to build from the basis of their strengths. And that sounds like it's a good idea, but it doesn't tend to be, because what happens is we overdevelop our strengths to the point that they become a weakness. And what we need for the kind of challenges that we're facing at the moment, if we'd like to work with other government agencies and we'd like to lead properly, is actually a bigger toolbox. So we need a bigger range. We need to vary the skills that we've got available to us, not put ourselves in a pigeonhole box about being an empathetic visionary leader or a disc whatever, and actually recognise that if we'd like to be future focused and if we'd like to have real impact, we actually need to be able to do all the things. And not at once, but we need to know when to dial into them, right? So this is my lock analogy, so stay with me on that one. So I reckon if we think about it like a lock, we'd go, well, it's like a master in the middle, right? It's like a master key in the middle. And I call this one flexibility. And you can read a whole bunch of data on this that either calls it versatility or something else. But flexibility is about our ability to bend without breaking, right? So the flexible leader is the one that, instead of when things change going, oh my God, things changed again, what am I going to do now? They're the ones who are like, yeah, BAU, that's what we do here in government. Things have been changing for the last 200 years and they're going to keep changing for the next 200. I'm not surprised by this. I'm aware of this, right? So awareness. I can recognize my own agency in responding to this. So that's that responsibility point, Deb. And I've got the resilience to continue to make decisions and lead people as things shift. So I reckon if we don't have this core skill of just absolutely being able to acknowledge consistent emerging change and being able to respond to it, there's almost no point working on any of the others. You know how when you do a budget, I remember being at uni and I was a single mum, you know, so money was pretty tight, and I'd do a budget and I'd be like, right, and this is how much I'm going to spend on food and so much I'm going to spend on rent, and okay, this is all good. And the first week you try and implement your budget, you're like, oh, well, it doesn't work this week because the rego's due, so I have to change it this week. But next week, I'll get back to the normal budget. And then next week, something else happens and you've got to fix your car, or the kid has to go to the doctor, or something else happens and you're like, oh, well, it won't work for the next couple of weeks, you know, but then what we'll do is we'll get back to the normal budget. And I think sometimes we lead like this and we make decisions like this. We went, oh, COVID, okay, we all have to go into lockdown for the next 4 weeks, and that's going to be a bit hard, but then we'll go, you know, back to the normal way of working, and we'll talk a lot about new ways of working in the middle, but actually we'll just have back-to-back Zoom meetings for 4 weeks, and then we'll go back into the office, right? And so the flexibility is about not going, I'm looking forward to getting back to normal, but going, yeah, cool, so there's no new normal, and my job as a leader is to shift with that and to sense those changes, so to be really attuned to my context, be really clear about what our capacity to respond is, and be ready for the next thing all the time. Awareness, agency, and resilience, that's what we need, right? So this one sits at the middle. If we don't have that, we don't have very much. But then I reckon there's 4 kind of core untaught skill areas, and these are things that we expect people to know by virtue of their ascent, their leadership journey, but we don't necessarily teach anyone, and it gets us into trouble. So the first of those is around decisions, right? This is the strategic arena. And this is like, how do you think? How do you make good decisions? And I think what tends to happen is you've got people who have made decisions that have turned out well, And so they've been promoted. They're a senior leader now. And it's assumed that they've got really good judgment, right? Because they must have good judgment because things went well. But actually judgment's not intuitive, and the results of a decision aren't necessarily indicative of whether or not it was a good one. Sometimes it's just luck. And what we don't tend to teach is, how do you think? How do you look at a problem and understand what it's made of? How do you make sense in a context with other people of what's the most important thing? How do you make sense and create a space together where you can actually start to take action and look at options and figure out a way forward? How do we make sense of the past? How do we make decisions for the present? How do we plan for the future? All of this stuff that sits inside the decision capability piece is where I've done most of my work over the last decade. And it tends to be, started off working in areas like business cases, like big spending proposals, and then working with executive teams. And I'm just consistently surprised at how often people have never been taught the basic critical thinking skills. And this is why those of us on this webinar who have an arts degree, this is why we have an edge. Everyone's like, what are you going to do? Serve fries at McDonald's? Haha, we have critical thinking. And so if you've done a humanities degree, you might have an edge here. But also there's just some really basic stuff about what a good decision looks like, how a good decision process works. We put a lot of rules in and policy guidelines about things like procurement or about service delivery. But what we don't make clear in those policies is actually what the process for making that good decision is. So how do we make sure that we're using the right criteria? How do we make sure we've spoken to the right people? How do we evaluate those choices and use those to inform another one? And if we do go as far as specifying a decision process, we tend to go, well, there's 5 steps. And you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you're done. And real life doesn't work like that. It goes 1, 2, 3, oh, new information, back to 2, test something out. Oh, that didn't work. Skip ahead to 4, back to 1, right? Got to 5, we've tried the minimum viable version. We've realised another way we're wrong, that's cool, we're going back. They're not linear processes. And if you have never learned the way that a good decision works, then it's really hard to engage in that well. So I reckon this one, we need to be developing our leaders to think how they make decisions. And then I reckon there's something in here around systems. And I'm really pleased to see that recognised in the Service Act, looking at systems leaders, right? So this is what you see. Because if we think about that Treasury story, it would be easy to start pointing fingers quite early. So it's a security breach, or it's a technology issue, or in the case of the chick behind the desk, it's a customer service training issue or a sign-in protocol issue. And you can spend all day putting out fires like that, dealing with symptoms right across the board. But what the systems leader does is they see things a little bit differently. So they ask better questions and they zoom out and go, why is this happening? How does it fit together? Why are people behaving like this? What are the things that impact that? What are the levers I can pull that start to change it? And so in Treasury, we start to go, oh, project governance doesn't make any sense from the beginning. So it's really hard to get the outcomes we're looking for. Oh, we don't actually have the right processes in place that incentivise security across the business. So if we fix it at reception, it's not going to help us because we don't have it anywhere. And so what we want out of systems leadership is to change the way that we see things so that we can actually look at the default. So what I think is interesting is if you came up in the public sector in the 90s, you've got a really clear view about the way things are and what the default is. And so when people are trying to change your contracts and your KPIs and your setup and the way that you recruit and the way that you lead, that feels hard because you've got all these unacknowledged defaults about the way things are and the way things should be. And what we need from systems leadership is that zoom out to go, well, let's just figure out what those defaults are and why they're there. Like the unpick we did at the start of this webinar. Oh, things are hard. Yeah, but why are they hard? And how did they get there? And what were the good reasons for that? And where do we go next? And it's asking those questions, diagnosing the default, designing a new one, being able to talk to people and recognise those connections, and then being able to actually delegate to those systems in a way that are more useful. Because at the moment, making good decisions in the public sector and delivering good services in the public sector depends largely on people. It depends on heroes, and it depends on people pushing against the system, doing good stuff even when it's hard, collaborating even though nobody wants to. But in a really good environment, what we have is systems that enable us to do that, that make that the default. And the systems leader knows that and goes, right, people will do the right thing if we make it easy, so let's make the right thing the only thing. So I reckon we don't teach this one either. Or if we do, we send people on like a 5-day design thinking course that blows their head off and they don't actually get it. Whereas actually, if we just learn to ask different questions and had a systems view built in, then we'd be a lot better off. The third one I reckon is about performance. And this is about what you do, right? Or what you make possible. You see here that it sits at the opposite side of the dial from the strategic stuff. So what tends to happen as you progress through your career is that you do stuff you're good at, and then you get rewarded for that. So then you do more of that. That's how we get the strengths overused, right? And so odds are that if you've come up in, say, a policy role, you're probably pretty good up here. You've got a bit of strategic stuff going on. That's your default. You're used to operating there. But what you might find a little bit more difficult is actually moving that policy into implementation space, right? It's actually driving the action forward to make things change. And it's because these sit in different parts of our brain and they require different capabilities from us. So if you've developed up here, you might find it a bit harder down here. And so that performance leadership is actually about how we drive results. And it's not about the micromanaging, getting on right in the detail, dance floory stuff that we like to do and that I see a bit of. So if you've taken a technical path to leadership rather than a policy or strategic path to leadership, you've probably been really good for quite a long time at delivering results because you know all the things. When that gets hard is when you reach the point where it's no longer your job to know all the things, but to lead the people who know all the things, to help them to drive performance. And then it gets tricky, right? Because that one is all about, hey, what's actually driving performance here? So it's zooming out a bit and going, what actually makes the difference here? Is it actually that if people are really motivated and trained really well, then we see results across the board? Or is it actually that if our customers have a great experience or our clients have a great experience, we know that that's the thing that drives performance and that's where we should put our energy? Or is it our internal systems that they're currently failing us because you've got to go to 5 different places to get the information you need? And if we fix that, that would drive it. And sometimes you can get lucky and just take a stab at something you care about and it works. But I think performance leadership is actually about being able to understand what it is that's driving that and then be really, really diligent about the way that you focus, like ruthless. How you focus your energy, how you prioritize your time, how you spend your budget, how you direct your team to focus on what really adds value, and then how you systemize and delegate everything else. So when it comes to performance, we tend to reward one-offs or people who are able to create a big change, but that's not necessarily helping everybody else figure out actually what does drive performance here and how do I get myself out of it and lead in a way that keeps other people accountable and that ensures quality. And that comes down to that planning and prioritization and focus. And I reckon I just spent 80% of my time, half the time, talking to people about how to set those priorities and how to make them real. Because we might have figured out, if we got up here at the strategic arena, what we need to be doing and what we need to be focusing on. But actually making that real and implementing that is a completely different skill set of its own. So this is the other one I think we need to be teaching our leaders of the future. And the one on the other side of systems, so this is where we take people out of it, right? And we go, let's not worry about what people are doing because they're the victims or the product of their environment. This one's all about influence. And I think this is another one that we either see as a intuitive skill. So, you're good with people or you're not good with people. You know, you're an extrovert or you're not. Or we think it's a bit yuck, particularly if we're in the public sector. We're like, I don't engage in politics. I'm not interested in politics. You know, I'm a free, frank and objective and impartial public servant. I don't have time to play games. I do the work, I do good work. And if it's good, it will get the attention it deserves. No, it won't. Just won't. Good ideas don't stand on their own. And so I think there's a whole piece in here about who you touch. Don't actually touch them, by the way. Part of what came in about the same time as health and safety was was inappropriate behaviour in the workplace, so we can't actually touch people. But influence, who you touch. And that's about that political savvy and being able to understand how to take your ideas and how to help them to have impact at scale, right? So we often talk about building buy-in or taking people on a journey, and that's crap too, because when we teach people that, we're just trying to manipulate them or do something to them, right? So what we need from our public sector leaders of the future is actually, how is it that we work with others in a way that brings together everybody's needs and fears and desires and agendas and actually creates something that's more than all of us. And I know that's what we want to do, and that's why we've got interdepartmental executive boards being set up and joint ventures being set up and systems leaders groups being set up. But we can set up as many of those groups as we like, and that's not going to be enough, because if we are currently depending on hot desking and collaboration posters, and that's not even helping like John and Jane who work 5 meters apart collaborate, then setting up interdepartmental boards isn't going to do the job unless people have those skills and they know how to build partnerships and how to be savvy and how to anticipate stakeholders' needs and mitigate issues before they get started. And I reckon the key with this stuff isn't to pigeonhole, isn't to go, this is the most important one, or that's the most important one, or I'm good here so I don't need to be good here. It's about going, well, if we overinvest anywhere, we're going to do ourselves a disservice, because that's only going to be effective for a certain period of time. And if what we need to do is solve really hard problems and work together really well, then we want a balanced toolkit to draw from, right? And to know, hey, we're solving something new here we haven't talked about before. We need to be operating in this space. This is all about how we think. So let's get strategic. Oh, this thing is done. The decision has been made. It's time to make it real. Boom. Let's dial into this area where we've got the skills to understand how to implement and how to drive performance. We've got issues popping up all over the place that aren't connected. That's cool. It's time for me to come over here. I need to get out of the clouds a little bit and actually start to unpick what all of those layers are that are making it difficult for us to operate. I've done that. I know how it all fits together, but I know that I'm not going to make anything change unless I'm able to connect with the people that are involved. It's time for me to dial in over here. You can't necessarily be in 2 places at once, and that's okay. But I think what we need is that variety, that ability to tap into the toolbox and to know when we need to move into each space. So I've just written a book about this, and I'm very excited about it because you can learn all of the things that fit into each one. But I think those are my 5. Now, what do you guys reckon? Do you reckon that covers it off? Or do you reckon there's something in there where you're going, Alicia, you've completely missed something here that we're not teaching people and they need? Check in the chat if you think there's a glaring hole in my beautiful lock. Such a fancy model. Excellent. I'm going to take your silence as absolute assent. Oh, Kelly, is the F flexibility or everything's fucked? Mate, we're positivists around here. Can I say fucked on a paid webinar? I mean, who knows? You've paid me here, so it's too late now. I'm going to take it for future-focused, fabulous flexibility rather than... Deb says there's a lot under decision-making, and I totally agree. And Catherine's saying, where does judgment fit in? And it's here, right? But it's also in here. So this flexibility piece around, hey, what do you see? What do you know? Who are you? Who are you connected to? How are you growing and learning and changing? I reckon a lot of that fits in here, because judgment's not a one and done. It's not like you just get good judgment, is it? It's one of those things where judgment depends on you being attuned and being aware and being connected and knowing your own fallibility and being able to recognize that there's a lot that you don't see and the way that you think doesn't always serve you. And so what that judgment is about is a continuous job of figuring out how it all fits together and changing yourself in response to changing your environment. I'm glad you like the lock, Deb. I promise it will look prettier in the book, but you know, right now it's just Alicia with her flip chart. Okay, so to close, I reckon it's worth going a little bit further than just me saying, hey, here's the 5 things that we need to focus on, because I think we get a lot of that. Like you could Google right now, you could go like HBR, the 7 key skills that leaders need or whatever. And knowledge isn't necessarily our gap. So when we ask Oh, success is unlocked. Yeah, cool, Kelly. That's great. Unlock your potential. The master key. We could take this analogy quite far, couldn't we? When we look at that kind of information, or we go to a conference and somebody puts up a PowerPoint slide and it's got 6 things on it, and we write down the 6 things and then we leave and we're like, it's not necessarily that helpful. And so what I'd like to really start a conversation about in the sector, and particularly with those of you who are involved in and have agency over the way that you recruit, the way that you train, the way you develop, the way you put together performance incentives, the way that you structure communication between different departments to make it possible, is that we actually dial into that systems part of the lock on the piece of paper I've removed. And we start to think about what we need to do to make that possible. Because remember, people will do the right thing if we make it the easiest thing, and I don't think we currently are. But does everybody know Maslow's hierarchy of needs? You know, with food and shelter at the bottom and self-actualization at the top and a whole bunch of stuff in the middle? Yeah, cool. So I reckon there's a hierarchy of organisational needs. So this is Mackay's hierarchy of organisational needs. And I reckon we need the full gambit when it comes to this leadership of the future stuff. So if we, oh, that's a shocking pyramid, isn't it? Chocolate, yeah, chocolate's definitely in there, Kelly. So I reckon down the bottom, the foundation piece for any organisation is your strategic direction, right? And one of the key principles of the leadership programs that I run when I do big ones is I can't just come in and give you guys an off-the-shelf like 6-piece unit for how you need to develop your leaders, because that's not necessarily relevant. So when we think about leadership development, you can't necessarily just copy-paste someone else's strategy. What we need is that actually, what are the challenges that we're facing in our place, and what are the skills that we need people to have to match that, right? So what's the direction that we're heading in, we think, and what needs to tie into that? So it might be that actually the ability to build relationships, if you're a really central, like multi-stakeholder or multi-agency group, is your key thing, right? If you can't build good relationships, nothing's going to happen. So it might be that because of that strategic direction, which is all about collaboration and community empowerment, that's where you need to put your emphasis. But if you don't actually have that clarity about where you're heading and why, it's really, really hard to make good choices about how to shape that as you track forward. So strategic direction, this is your number one, this is your food and shelter, right, of hierarchy of organisational needs. And then I reckon there's one in here about systems and rules. So don't tell people to collaborate and make it hard for them to do it. Don't ask them to take risks and then penalise them for it in their performance development processes. Set up your systems and create the rules in a way that encourage the behaviours that you're looking for rather than making them difficult. And we've done that at a sector level now. That's cool. We've got this really great guidance, and the State Services Commission has done just a stunning job. I'm so into it. It's great. But actually, if we can't make this happen inside our own organisations or even our own teams, we're asking for trouble, right? So don't get mad at Christine for kicking me down the hallway. Just make it impossible to do anything but, right? Systems and rules. Then I think there's a piece in there about leadership. And this is a bit meta, right? Because it's your leaders of leaders. So another one of the rules of our leadership development program is, so first I need a session with your exec team because I need to know where you're heading so that we can shape that. And then the next one is you can't just hand it over. You can't just outsource your leadership development and go, we've got an Alicia Mackay and she's going to teach you to lead. Actually, I need you in the program with me. And I need 3 or 4 executive sponsors who are part of that process and checking in with those people, because leaders lead, right? And unless we have that connection, it's really difficult to do anything else. So hierarchy of organisational needs, strategic direction, systems and rules, leadership. Then we look at capability, right? And this is the kind of stuff that we're talking about at the moment. What are the skills that we need so that people can do the job that we're asking them to do? And so stop training people to be technical experts and then putting some people leadership on it if what we're asking them to do is big picture strategic systems change. Skill them in what we need. Teach them the untaught stuff. Teach them how to have difficult conversations with grumpy people. Teach them how to create ideas that people want to buy into. Teach them how to look at a system instead of looking at a problem. Teach them to dissolve a problem rather than solve a problem. Show them how to make good decisions instead of telling them why their decisions are wrong. So capability. Then we've got structure. And those of you who are used to me ranting about the restructure or caught the first part of this webinar will know that I firmly believe it lives up here, not down here. And I know that we've been fiddling with this because it's been the easy thing for us to fiddle with, because it's been a tool that we've had available over the last couple of decades. But shuffling the deck chairs on the Titanic and making people fear for their jobs is not the answer if you would like to see better leadership. So it sits up here. If you know where you're going, you've set it up to make it possible, you've got strong leadership that sets a good example, and people have the right skills and knowledge to do a good job, then you can restructure. If you do it early, you're just going to lose your good people. And right at the top of the hierarchy of organisational needs is culture. Because the thing about culture, much like self-actualisation in Maslow's hierarchy, is that it's largely an output and it's never done. So when people say, the problem with this place is the culture, and we actually need culture change, so we have to do that before we can do anything else, you're doing it backwards. It's chicken and egg. Like, culture's not a thing that you just change. You can't buy a new culture and install it. Culture is something that if people know what they're there for and they believe in it, they're enabled to do it, they're led well, they have the skills and the autonomy and the mastery to do a good job, and they're in the right structure to make it possible, you'll get your culture, mate. You don't even need a poster on the toilet door. People will just do a good job and they will lead well, but it pops out the top. And so I guess my challenge to you to conclude this is, cool, we know where we've been, we know where we like to go. We've got an understanding of what the things are that we're not teaching people to make it possible for that to happen. We know we need to be flexible. What are the other 4? Anyone remember the other 4? 10 points in the chat for who can say the other 4 the fastest. Systems, nice. Good one, Catherine. 3 to go. Decisions, nice. Influence, yeah. There's one, was it performance? Yeah, perfect. We know that those are the things that we need to actually be teaching people if we want their jobs to be relevant, their skills to be relevant, not just in a few years' time, but actually as our environment continues to shift and our public service keeps reshaping and everything keeps shifting, right? But we also know that telling people that isn't enough, that knowing those skills are what's important isn't enough, and that if we want to create change, we need to think more holistically about the way that we actually bring people in, develop them, incentivize them, direct them, enable them, lead them, develop their skills, how we line them up. And that actually there's a whole view that we need here. And so my challenge to you is to think about where you think the gaps are, either in your leadership or in your team or organisation, and where on the hierarchy you think you are currently for what you need to shift. It might be that you know exactly where you need to go, but your rules are off. It might be that your rules are good, but your leaders don't really know what they're asking for. I don't know what the answer is for you guys, but you are more than welcome to send me an email and let me know once you've had a thought about it, about where your gaps are and what needs to shift. All right, we've reached our 1 hour. And for any of you who want to rewatch, because I speed through, because that's how I am, I'm very fast, then Nikki will be sending out the recording. So you're welcome to take a look at that, especially for those of you who came in late. And if you're excited about my book like I am, you are more than welcome to head to my website, aliciamackay.co.nz/books. It's not available for pre-order yet, but you can jump on the list so that when it's up there, you are the first in the know. All right, everyone, it was so good to have you here this afternoon. I hope this was useful. You guys are awesome. Ka kite, enjoy the rest of your afternoon. See you later.